Hey, how's it going? Welcome back to the channel. It's been quite a while since I last made a video, so I decided that I was going to make an update video, just because I wanted to. Full disclaimer, I've scripted most of this. I'm keeping relatively loose to the script, but I just wanted to say in case I talked in a bit of a stilted way, that's probably the reason. But either way, I'm gonna get into the main points of this video.
Hold up.
It's me from the future interrupting because I wanted to say some stuff. First of all, you probably noticed how long the video is. I'll be honest, you'll know why when you get there. But more importantly than that, I wanted to talk about some stuff because I'm not the best at talking, even in the real world. So you can probably imagine that talking like to a microphone for a video is even more difficult. So I wanted to talk about some stuff ahead of time. I have this really annoying tendency, and I do not do it on purpose, okay? But I have this really annoying tendency to like not know what word I'm trying to like think of. Like I'm trying to think of a word, and it's like what's the word? I'm trying to think of it, and the word that comes into my head is just some fucking like pretentious sounding ass like overcomplicated word that is way more complicated than actually it needs to be. And then like I'll sit for another like 2 seconds and it's like multitude, and it's just there's lots of this, right? It's like, you know, it's not like I had an option of choosing like a normal word sitting in my head. I had nothing. My mind was empty. And you'll see me do that a couple times, and I just want you to know, it annoys me too. But the other thing is, you know, like I said, I find it difficult to talk, sometimes. And so, a lot of the time, I'll sort of fall back and just sort of like, fuck it, just get like whatever words I'm trying to say out. I forget about how what I'm saying comes across, and I just say the words, and sometimes that comes across in a bit of a weird way. So I just wanted to warn you ahead of time, just because I know this shit is annoying to listen to, because I had to listen to it to edit it. But I'm trying. Either way, I will appear from time to time throughout the video because I'm re-recording some stuff. So yeah, if you notice a random change in volume or quality, that's me, I'm there. Yeah, and I've also had to record this multiple times, so I've decided to give you a little visual treat in the form of a different slug cat for each version of me, so you're welcome. But either way, that's all I really felt the need to say right now. If there's anything else, I'll pop back up. So the reason I was away for so long in the first place was because you might remember, if you were watching, that I was taking part in an academy, a software academy, and I wanted to basically focus on that. The intention of that was they were going to put me into a job, and that fell through, which is epic, aye. After that, I spent a lot of time looking for a job, as you'd expect, and during that period I just found it kind of difficult to think about making videos while I was thinking about doing all that, and so I continued to not make videos and basically forget about them. After a while, I finally actually managed to get a job in software, and then I had to move. I had to move a fair way, right? It was quite difficult. Then I spent a lot of time settling in, still sort of moving in my stuff, and I wasn't thinking about this. And then after I started the job, and I did start to think about this stuff because I was finally in more of a settled place, I was also still sort of thinking, I don't really know when I'm going to have free time, what kind of motivation I'll have for making videos. So I kind of wanted to keep it waiting. So that's the big gap. There's a bit more of like, it's been a bit of a while since I first thought about making this video, and now, but I've been trying to get back in now, and it's been taking some effort, so hopefully now it'll be doable. So what are the plans for the future? basically more or less the same as I was doing on a surface level. Probably the biggest thing though that I'm thinking of doing at some point in the future is like a channel rebrand, because from the beginning my name's been, well, it's changed once. Like I think I had like 2 videos and I was like, I'm changing this to something else. And I changed it to Just Some Slugcat because I liked this idea of like eventually having people ask me, why do you call yourself that? And I can talk to them, I can tell them about Rain World and where it came from, and I can be like, that's a good game. But nowadays, I mean, Rain World still sits in that place as being one of my favourite games just because it's special to me. But, you know, the whole thing about making a personality about a specific character from some specific thing is a bit weird, to be honest. So I'm stepping away from it. And I do have ideas. I pretty much know exactly the direction I want to go, but I don't really want to start doing it yet for like a couple of reasons, right? The first one is because the things I want to do are like having a nice logo and a nice channel banner. I wouldn't really be able to do it that well because I don't have that much art skills, and I don't, even though I could feasibly find someone to pay to do it, like I wouldn't feel like I have as much of a personal connection to it as I would if I actually just made it myself. So that's what I'd want to do. And I do think at some point when I have a bit less stuff on my plate, I'll be able to take the time and effort to like look at art courses online or something like that, and I think I'll be able to do it. It's just whether I'll ever actually get around to doing it. But the other reason that I wanted to do a rebrand, or rather the other reason I wanted to wait before I did a rebrand, is because I kind of want to be more sure that I'm able to move the channel forward from just like the stuff I'm doing now to other stuff I want to do in the future. Which isn't too radical, it's just that there are like ideas I've had about types of videos I want to make, and I want to be able to wait to the point where I can say, okay, the period where I was just some slugcat has ended and we are moving forward into a new era. And so actually to go into some of those ideas of where I want to move forward in the future, it mostly revolves around one category, which is the idea that I want to share some of the ideas that I've had. And I'm thinking like the sort of like video essay type of shit you usually see on YouTube. I'm saying shit, I'm not giving shit to it, but it's not going to be like that exactly, because I still kind of want to be a I Play Games channel. That's, for whatever reason, the main thing I'm interested in doing. But I want to be more comfortable with the idea of making like a video where I can just write a script about some idea that I've had, something that I've thought about that I want to talk about. But like I say, I want to sort of keep it mostly gameplay related, and my main thought is having this sort of dual thing where I play games most of the time, but in those videos I can stop for some small amount of time to talk about this thing I want to talk about. Not like something completely irrelevant, I'd be playing the game that I had thoughts about, or that had some relevance to whatever I had thoughts about, and then stopping at the point that's most relevant and switching on the fucking projector screen or whatever, fucking going into video essay mode, and then coming back to the gameplay is an idea I really liked. And another part of the reason is just because I'm not super confident like in just making video essays, because I feel like I'm not skilled enough with all that to take these ideas that I'm having and stretch them out into like a whole video. And it's not like I'd really want to artificially stretch them out if I only had a small bit to say about it anyway. So I think that's like a good form factor, even though maybe it'll be a bit of a like, I'm here to watch the newest Let's Play of Silk Song, and suddenly this guy's talking about some completely weird shit. It's like, what's going on? But I don't know. I like the idea of doing it anyway. But the main reason that I like the idea of doing that so much is because, like, for a lot of the time, the ideas that I have are usually specifically, like, in response to something that happens in a game, like some story beat happens, or maybe not a response to some story beat, but like something that I've suddenly thought of because of something that happened in the story of a game. But that is something I'm thinking of doing. So that more or less encompasses all the things that I am intending to do in the future on my channel. So originally I just wanted to jump straight into this next section because I couldn't really think of a good way to segue into it, but I wanted to give you an overall explanation anyway, even if this isn't really any better of a segue. Basically, like I was saying earlier, I'm interested in having more commentary on like the stories of games I play, and so I'm definitely not against like talking about certain subjects, but my point is there are certain subjects when it comes to stories that are either like really broad and overarching, or that I've wanted to talk about somewhere, but I don't really want to talk about on the channel because they don't feel that relevant, which I probably would talk about if they came up directly in the story of a game I happen to play, but don't want to just, I feel like if I don't talk about them now or soon, then I'd end up finding excuses to talk about them, in places that they don't really belong. So talking about it now and getting it out of the way is something I want to do. And there is some sort of roundabout way that these things do tie back into the actual channel in terms of like a channel update, but for a lot of it, it's just stuff I want to talk about. That's about it for the segue, so get ready to die violently. So this section is related to a concept from an essay written in 1967 called Death of the Author. I don't know how you feel hearing that phrase. I don't know if that's what you expected me to be talking about, but this is an essay that introduces an idea that an author's intentions for their own story is unimportant, and that the audience should be encouraged to have their own interpretation and put more value in it than the author's own intentions. There is a problem, not directly with the essay necessarily, but more with the way that people have interpreted it. And that's because if you are reading the essay, you're going to fit into one of two categories, where you are either an average person who would be an audience member to stories, or you are an author or director or songwriter or whatever. And being in those two different positions means that you're in a way forced to interpret it in one of two different ways. So the first interpretation is if an audience member takes some lesson from a story, but that lesson obviously isn't the intention of the author. Either it's not really what they were focusing on, or perhaps it's the exact opposite of what the author meant. It doesn't matter, because the audience member's interpretation is more important than that of the author. Now that interpretation is still a bit iffy, depending on exactly how you take it, because if you're saying something like the actual intentions of the author have nothing to do with the story at all, then that's disingenuous, because the entire point of a story with a meaning is that the author is trying to tell you something. So I'd say that the better form of that interpretation is, if you disagree with or take away a lesson that's unrelated to the intention of the author, you are valid to say either, I know this isn't the lesson that the author meant for me to take away from this, but I think this is a good lesson anyway. Or even to say something like, I know this is what the author's trying to tell me, but I specifically disagree with this. I think this is completely wrong. So I do think that this first interpretation can be a bit off depending on how you take it. But the main issue is the second interpretation, which is the interpretation mostly taken by other authors. See, if you're an author and death of the author is a concept that you think is important, it's quite likely that you're not just going to want to practice it personally. You're going to want to spread the concept through your own work. And there's a couple ways to do it, where one of them is simply to just push it as the core message in a story that you decide to make. But the problem is that from a lot of perspectives, although it might not actually be true, doing that might seem as if it goes against the principle of death of the author itself. Like they're directly saying to you to follow this principle, which if you're directly taking it at face value goes against the principle. Again, it's not perfectly exactly the case, but I think a lot of authors would feel like they're being a bit surface level by saying that they care about this principle, and yet here they are directly pushing that principle to their audience, so I have to do it a different way. And the problem is, the most common way it seems that most authors land on to spread that principle to their audience is by not only encouraging audiences to substitute their own personal interpretations into a story, but by actively hiding their own intentions of the story from the audience by leaving certain things unsaid. To be clear with that, I'm not trying to tell you that any time an author doesn't specifically go out of their way to answer any question you might come up with about a story is awful and they need to be held accountable. But it's also a little difficult to tell the difference, unless you aren't thinking really hard about it, what the difference is between just any old question that you could ask about a story and the questions that are core to the story, that leaving those questions unanswered can often be a pretty bad thing. So, for the sake of making it a bit easier to understand, I'll give you a couple examples. So first of all, think if you were reading a book like Lord of the Rings, and, occasionally Gandalf will go around casting spells, you might start theorizing what the rules behind the magic are. But in reality, you wouldn't need an answer to those questions, because you'd know implicitly that a question like that is not the point of the story. The magic is just a driver to the plot and doesn't have any complex rules, otherwise the story would either make the rules apparent or make some kind of mystery out of the fact that you don't know the rules. You might still choose to theorize about the rules of the magic, but it's something that you would do casually with other Lord of the Rings fans on like an online forum or like Reddit or something. So I hope you understand that the kind of unanswered mysteries that I really mean are questions that are central to the story being told, that are left as gaps. Sometimes those gaps are mistakes, or sometimes they were intended to be filled out in a sequel, which was cancelled or hasn't come out yet, or something like that. And sometimes the act of hiding the answer to a certain mystery is actually an important part of that story's theme, although those examples may still be issues in themselves, depending on the individual story. But it's the stories that hide the author's intention for no other reason than to hide the author's intention, whether that's someone knowingly keeping their audience in the dark, or someone who writes the same way they see other authors write, simply because they think that's the way you're supposed to write meaningful stories. Those are the stories that I'm going to be talking about. It should be obvious at this point that I'm not a big fan of that side of the principle, and that's the main reason why I'm going to talk about it. I'm going to talk about that specific idea of taking away the meaning of your interpretation and how it actually causes more issues than I think it solves. But before I get into that directly, I want to talk about why I think it is actually so popular, because you'd probably imagine that audiences would not particularly like stories that refuse to reveal the big, mysteries of them. I'm sure you've at least come across some sort of sentiment of like, oh, a book left a big cliffhanger and then never revealed it, and that's cringe. But you would generally imagine that audiences overall prefer to understand what they're looking at. And you'd obviously expect there to be every now and then the occasional person who's like, oh, I actually prefer when they don't explain the story because I'm epic like that. But you wouldn't expect it to be the majority of people. So why does it seem like there's such a huge popularity for things like this? Like, you'll always get people complaining, but they're generally seen as like the idiots who just don't get it. So why is there so many people who like seem to prefer things like that? And you could explain part of it with stories that do hide their meaning from the audience, but the actual story or the actual movie or game or whatever the story is a part of is just so good that no one really wants to give shit to it. They don't want to let what's good about it down just so that they can complain about the story not being fully explained to them. Equally, you could also explain a fair chunk of it by talking about stories that, again, they do prevent the audience from understanding them properly, but they're also so esoteric that most of the audience just assumes the reason they don't understand is because they're just too stupid, and the answer was in there somewhere, but I'm just too dumb to understand it, which means anyone who does, perhaps they do understand it enough to recognize that the ending has been left out, or perhaps they don't understand it, but they are making a guess that, I think actually the author went out of their way to stop you from understanding this. And that's a bad thing, at least in this situation. And in that situation, you would expect people who'd say things like that to be told, it's not trying to hide the explanation, you're just too stupid to understand it. And that helps to push a bad lesson that in situations like that, when you see a story that you don't understand the ending of, you should be passive and just assume that, oh no, I just don't get it. Because if you do complain about that, then that just means you're stupid. Which could be the case in some circumstances, but again, it teaches you to be used to the idea of not understanding stories, and therefore you would avoid criticizing it even when it's obvious. So it's pretty obvious that I do have a problem with that as well, but that's like a whole other can of worms that I don't want to open. Basically, my point is both of those examples do actually go some way to explaining why there is so many people who are outwardly okay with stories that don't allow you to understand the meaning, whether or not they explicitly explain them or not. But the reason I'm using those two examples are because you can actually explain them relatively easily. But there is a third reason, which is the main thing I want to focus on, and is a little bit more tricky to explain outright. So I want to start off by, I guess, talking about an allegory to make it a bit more easy to understand. And I'm reading this directly off the script, so sorry if it's a bit stilted. Imagine a TV show that has a long-standing mystery element, and the main reason everyone is watching is because every single person is waiting with bated breath to find out the big reveal to the big mystery. Suddenly, the show just ends with a jarring and unsatisfying reveal that leaves a load of questions unanswered. Obviously, as you'd expect, a lot of people are going to be upset with this ending and will be complaining about it. So, imagine coming across a comment or a Twitter post or some YouTube video where someone's talking about how shit the ending is, and maybe they're being a bit too much of an asshole about it. Maybe they're being a bit too overly sarky. And they're like, what were they thinking, these fucking idiots? And you go down to the replies or the comments or whatever, and you see that someone has left a reply saying, actually, the reason you don't like the show is because you can't deal with not understanding the ending. You're a big baby that has to have everything explained to you. And all of a sudden, there's an immense explosion in popularity of a sentiment that everyone who doesn't enjoy this show is actually just a big molding baby. And of course, if everyone who doesn't enjoy this show is a big baby, any other piece of media that people don't, and they don't like it because they didn't even bother writing an ending. They're actually just some kind of low IQ dumbass who they don't have the capacity to deal with this kind of stuff. I can deal with it because I'm a big boy. And over time, more and more people join in with this sentiment, partly to avoid being accused themselves, and partly because you get to join in with the group of people who are correct and who are better. Obviously in the real world it doesn't come across that obviously, but there is genuinely, specifically of stories that have like unexplained like plot elements, where people who criticized the fact that they aren't explained are almost immediately looked down as people who they're this kind of person who like immediately emotionally lashes out in anger at anything that makes them uncomfortable or that they don't understand, which obviously there's people who are like that. You know, that's why that sentiment kind of makes some sort of sense. There are people who are entitled enough that the moment something makes them uncomfortable, they just go off in it without bothering to think about why it makes them uncomfortable or whether they are actually in the wrong for feeling that way. But the problem is it's one of those issues where simply because someone acting like that could be accused of being this type of person, no one wants to act like that, even if they know that's not the type of person they are. They could be accused of it, so I don't want to do it. There's also another good reason for that instinct, which is more to do with like why people like edgy jokes and like gory movies so much. People will callous their emotions to make themselves more able to deal with uncomfortable things. And the through line that relates it back to this is that often it'll come along with this feeling of, oh yeah, I'm so much better than all the other weenies at school because I can deal with with watching Ned Flanders get shot to death on this Newground animation. That's not me shitting on it, even though, like, you know, everyone knows that we were all kind of goofy ass kids in high school. But the point is that you'll always have this emotion at the back of your head, ready to take something that you find uncomfortable and essentially smooth it out into becoming something that feels okay, given that doing that seems to be so much of an important part of our instinct to like grow up in our culture as humans. But the main problem is there's no real way to reliably determine whether something that makes you uncomfortable is actually valid, or if it's something that you should get over, which is why it's so easy for that emotion to be taken advantage of when it's not actually appropriate, whether it's actually being taken advantage of on purpose by someone with bad intentions, or if it's just something that happens. And that's the whole point of that TV show analogy. One of the main reasons why stories that purposefully remove their resolution and other plot points are so popular isn't really necessarily because they are better than the alternative. It's because people are quite scared to be looked down on as incapable of dealing with something uncomfortable. Quite often very early on in their lives, before they'd have, be in that type of situation to think about it more critically, they block out whatever part of them feels uncomfortable entirely, and they just don't think about it. Another reason, on top of that, for why so many people may find it hard to accept that something uncomfortable is actually bad is simply because of how long they spent being okay with it. Because so many people learn this lesson early on in life, they see it as some kind of overall life progression, like something they've grown out of, and it feels like something that has built them as a person. And when someone sees something like this as something that they've grown out of or grown as a person away from, it makes it way more difficult to step away from, for a number of different reasons, but mainly if in any situation they are wrong to wave away that discomfort they feel as just being something to ignore. Not only would it make them wrong now, it would also mean that they were possibly wrong every other time they did it throughout their life. Which means there's not only a whole lifetime of decisions they made about things that could have been incorrect, but there's probably entire parts of their personality that are the way they are because of those decisions they made in the past. So people have a really big reason to avoid the idea of them being wrong, not just for ego, but for the defense of their personality as it stands. Hence why it's often something that people will take an uncharacteristically unlogical stance on. Nice script. They might, defend something or say something that just doesn't really make sense. And they'd usually, very easily be able to understand that doesn't make sense. But they defend it regardless. They really push against it. They really push this idea that, yeah, no, this is definitely the case, even when it obviously makes no sense, because they're defending their entire personality in some cases. Anyway, so all of that isn't to blanket all stories with unresolved elements as being inherently bad. It's just that even the stories that are definitely bad are quite often very difficult to criticize, because the issues behind that style of writing are so ingrained into some people that I'll often defend them without even thinking, because they know it's true and there's no reason to reconsider it. But I want you to understand that all of that so far is not even the main issue that I have with writers that integrate death of the author into their stories. I just need to get that out of the way in case any of you motherfuckers was gonna say that about me. I ain't a big baby, alright? The actual issue that I have with it is the main intention of Death of the Author, as far as I can tell, and certainly it seems to be the main motivation behind authors that spread it through their work, is to give power to the audience by removing the authority of the author and placing power over the meaning in the hands of the worker, of the audience. And that's communist, so it's bad. The problem is, Death of the Author actually takes power away from the audience. So, once again, explaining this directly is going to be a bit complicated, so I want to explain this through an analogy. I want you to imagine that there's this art gallery, and it doesn't matter what most of the art in there is. There is one room in the gallery where during a 2-day show there will be 2 different sculptures on display. On both of those days, 3 different people will come and look at the sculpture. The first person is your average guy off the street. The second and third people are more artsy and are quite used to visiting art galleries. I want to interject this analogy is less about actual high art and artistry, and is supposed to be a metaphor for itch.io horror games, or music that most people listen to. So the first person is more of a stand-in for your grandpa who's watch this Deltarune I heard about. Watch this Five Nights at Frankie's the kids are always listening to. And the second and third person are your average person who listened to Hey Ya and was hold on a second, something's off with these lyrics. So, the first person, when they come in, they look at the sculpture and they're this is some modern art shit, what the hell's going on? I don't know. And they give a guess, and then they leave, and they have no idea what it's about. Which is probably what they expected, and they're thinking whether they're actually gonna bother coming in the next day, because it's didn't really get much out of that. The more important people, the second and third person, the main difference you need to understand between the second and third person is that one of them is right and one of them is wrong. Okay? So, the second person, they look at the sculpture, they're yes, it's very sculpturesque, and they make a guess as to what the sculpture means, and then they leave and they move on to the other art pieces in the gallery. The third person goes in, makes a guess about the sculpture's meaning, and then leaves and moves on to the other art. So the main takeaway from that is obviously, because neither of these audience members will ever know the actual author's intention behind the art, neither of them is going to feel like their personal interpretation is being overshadowed by the official interpretation. On the second day, the first person comes in first again, and they walk in and they see a different sculpture. They take a guess as to what they think that sculpture actually represents. They're not particularly confident in their guess. They're who fucking knows? I don't know. But as they're about to leave, they see on the back of the door is a plaque. And on that plaque, it gives some information about the sculpture, including the author's intended interpretation, what the sculpture actually represents officially. When this person finishes reading this plaque, they say, "Oh, that's what it meant." Right? They're satisfied, they're happy, because unlike before, where they had no idea what this was supposed to mean whatsoever, now they're having it explained to them, so they feel like they're actually a part of this. They don't feel like they've wandered in off the street and they're not meant to be there. They feel like they actually know what's going on, they're a part of this art. They feel good about that, which is important, right? Not just because they have that satisfaction and that feeling of being an actual part of things, but also because having experienced an explanation for a piece of art's meaning, they are now more able to interpret the meaning of other pieces of art, at least in that sort of artistic subculture. And that kind of shows how Death of the Author can contribute to elitism in art. Not purposefully, but still by outcome. Disallowing people who aren't already a part of the club from being able to come in and know really what everyone's talking about, know what's going on, and be able to come up with their interpretations. Because obviously the intention of Death of the Author is everyone can come up with their own interpretation. Everyone has authority with their interpretation. But if you don't really know what kind of explanations you would ever even come up with for a piece of art, even a story, then you have no hope of ever having an interpretation in the first place. And so that's kind of cringe. I'm interrupting to make a couple points after that. First, you might feel like the whole plaque thing is a bit pretentious. The idea of just explaining the meaning behind your art in front of someone like you think they're too stupid to work it out themselves, especially when you consider that the real world equivalent outside of this analogy would be like the after credits section of like a horror mystery game, just being like a guy in a room explaining the whole story to you. You'd be like, okay, I guess that was the answer. But in reality, it's less of a direct representation of having just an explanation in your face, and more about having any way at all of communicating the meaning behind your story. So it might be something more explicit, like a band explaining the meaning behind a song in a later interview, or it might just actually be giving enough information in your story for the target audience to understand it by the end. But even past that, I still think that even though giving the meaning of your art is often seen as being arrogant and imposing yourself, I think it's genuinely a lot less arrogant than the concept of just deciding that you should take away the very option of knowing what your art is about just because you know what's best for your audience more than they do. But as you might have guessed, seeing as I'm only part way through this analogy, even that isn't the main issue that I have with this version of Death of the Author. So, we will forget about this first guy, and we're just remembering the second and third guy. The second person goes in, and like the first day, they look at the sculpture and they say, "Oh, I think that this shape represents a person throwing an empty can on the floor, and it represents humanity's mistreatment of nature, while the person filming with their phone pointing with their mouth agape represents humanity's lack of care, pointing and basically laughing as if it means nothing." When they go to leave, they see the plaque on the door and they read it, and when they find out their guess was right, they feel absolutely tip-top. They feel absolutely smashing. I can't believe I got it right. And they head home with a pure pep in their step. But more importantly than anything, the third person makes their guess as well, and when they go to leave, they also read the plaque, only to find out that their interpretation was wrong, and so they leave disappointed, and they aren't pure tip-top with a pure pep in their step. So obviously this is demonstrating the problem that Death of the Author is trying to fix, which is that anyone who has an interpretation that goes against the intention of the author is disappointed and essentially has that interpretation replaced with the author's. And obviously, there's a lot more quote-unquote wrong interpretations you can have than there are right interpretations, so obviously that definitely feels bad. But there's something that this justification leaves out. If we go back to the third person in the sculpture room, we can see what their interpretation actually is. When the third person looks at the sculpture, he says, well, obviously, this over here is a person throwing a can on the ground, which represents humanity's mistreatment of nature. While this over here is a person filming with their phone, pointing and shouting, broadcasting the situation and blaming the person responsible. And yet, the person recording has no intention of actually doing anything to stop it. Obviously, you might agree or disagree with that as a message on its own, but the point I'm making is that the third guy is really dead set on that being the intention of that sculpture, and he's excited about it. Not mainly because it's a message that he hasn't often seen represented, but actually because, in this case, this is something that he has never even thought about before. This isn't an opinion he's had for years and years, and suddenly now he feels vindicated seeing it in front of him. It's something that he has literally never thought about before, and now, seeing this sculpture that he believes is giving this message is world-shattering. Maybe it's not that big of a deal, but, I can't believe this artist came up with such a profound take on this subject. So when he goes and he reads the plaque, he's not just upset that he got it wrong. They were disappointed that an idea that they saw as being completely new, that they had never seen or heard be depicted in any art before, which they thought was being presented by a figure of authority, that being the artist. They're disappointed because it turns out that was completely non-existent, and instead this piece of art that they thought was revolutionary actually just resembled something that they'd seen 1,000 times before. And so it's not just that they're disappointed, it's that they feel almost as if they would have felt if they were, say, at some speech where every audience member gets to go up and speak at the podium, except halfway through their interpretation they had the mic yanked away from them. You can imagine this third guy had been thinking this all along, and suddenly that thought is being represented by someone with authority. But it's not that he'd been thinking it all along. It's that when he saw that piece of art, it was as if some completely new idea had been explained to him, but it had just completely come out of nowhere.
Have you ever had a dream?
And he had come up with it on his own. And now here it is, actually being replaced in his mind with something completely meaningless. So this even more closely encompasses and explains the sort of purpose of Death of the Author, because you do genuinely feel like your opinion is being oppressed in some way. But I want you to understand, when this guy is upset at his viewpoint not being represented after all, what does he do with that feeling? Like, maybe he'll just go home and forget about it. Or maybe he'll be bitter about it forever and he'll never forget. But maybe they'll have the motivation to create their own sculpture, very similar to the one that they saw, but with the right changes for it to represent what they believed it represented. And maybe they'll have their own plaque on the back of the door, explaining their viewpoint. And this shows the most genuinely worrying issue with Death of the Author, because whether artists are even knowingly implementing Death of the Author, or whether they're just doing it because it's the kind of thing that you do as an artist or as a story writer, because they are taking away that opportunity for disappointment, audiences may never have the motivation to create their own art, and they'll just stay in the very state that Death of the Author claims to pull them out of, which is the state of being essentially held captive by artists who have power that those audience members don't. And I mean, obviously that's a bit of a flowery way of putting it, but my whole point is, if you really think Death of the Author is that important to audiences, the fact that it not only doesn't succeed in what it's trying to do, but actually actively goes against what it's trying to do, shows that it kind of is not that great. I want to give a reminder that I'm really only talking about one half of Death of the Author, which is the interpretation held by most authors. In terms of the other interpretation, I'm actually pretty supportive of it, but that's something I'm going to talk about later. Right now I wanted to finish off the Death of the Author stuff by going over something that doesn't really fit into the whole story I've just told you, but still, I think, important to say. Basically, all the stuff I've said up till now is to explain how people might miss out on being motivated to create their own art after being disappointed in finding out that their view wasn't actually represented like they thought it was. In reality though, most people, and I still think it's important for those few left over, but most people aren't really gonna be able to make their own art, let alone actually have the motivation to do it, seeing as they've got shit to do in their own life, and they maybe just don't care that much. So I wanted to finish off by talking about how I think it's also detrimental to the average person as well as just the people who might have otherwise made their own stuff. So imagine that there's a song you really like, and the main thing you like about it is what you think the song is about, but you're not really sure if you're correct since a lot of the lyrics are vague, and there's pretty big parts of it that you don't really get, but you really wish you understood. So you decide to look up the meaning of the song online, hoping that someone knows more about the song or band than you do and has a solid interpretation, or that the band themselves have done an interview talking about the song. But after a while of searching, all you can really find is a bunch of different people giving very vague interpretations, which all have pretty big holes or leave pretty wide portions of the lyrics unexplained. Because of that, over time, you kind of stop caring about what the song actually was about and you move on. But along with that, you end up no longer caring about what you thought the song was about, and that ends up getting lost. So imagine it went slightly different. Say, when you were searching up the meaning of the song, you did find an interview with the artist who explains what their song actually meant. Except it turns out that the real meaning of the song was different to what you thought it was. So much like the situation before. Except obviously in this situation, you aren't a songwriter, you aren't going out of your way to make music, you're just someone taking a bit of time out of your life to listen to some music, and now you're forced to be disappointed that this song actually meant something completely different to what you thought it did. Maybe you'd imagine that you'd be very, very disappointed, and you'd be upset about it for ages, or maybe you'll never be able to listen to the song ever again because it's so upsetting that it means something different to what you thought it did. And I can't really say that either of those are wrong, even though I think maybe they're a bit over the top. But I'll give you an explanation of how it happened for me. Basically, there was a certain song, and I was like, what's this song about? Same situation. And before finding out the song's real meaning, I was stuck in like a kind of a limbo, where I was like, I'm pretty sure this is the meaning of the song. And when I came up with the meaning of the song, I was like, that's pretty cool. But as time went on, I was like, well, you know, I can't really explain what this verse means, and I don't really have any idea what he's talking about here. And I felt like my interpretation was just kind of silly and invalid, because how could I really have any right to say what I think it's about when I don't even know what like half of the lyrics even mean? So I went and I looked for an interpretation of the song, and I found an interview from the person who actually made it, and they explained what it was about, and I was completely wrong. But instead of being disappointed that my interpretation was completely incorrect, it made me more confident in holding that interpretation because at that point it was my own decision. Beforehand, I was stuck waiting to find out what the author actually meant. Me holding that interpretation was a sort of bootleg. I don't really get to see what the real version is. I have to make up my own explanation. But when I found out what it actually meant, it was like I was done with the whole actually finding out what it was about, and I could finally decide whether I actually agreed or not, or if I thought there was a more fitting interpretation, or at least one that I preferred for the song. So my whole point in that is that, again, keeping the meaning of your art from your audience actually makes it harder for them to feel comfortable with having their own interpretation on it, because they're waiting to find out what it's about before they can decide whether they agree or not. And realistically, in the end, past all of the stuff I've said, you can't really expect your audience to respect their own interpretation if you aren't even giving them the chance to respect yours. Now, I don't want to undermine my own point, because I do believe in all that stuff. I do think it's important, but there is a circumstance that's still been left out that needs to be talked about, which is, what about a situation, again we're using the example of a song here, where you have a song that you like, you don't know what it's about, maybe it's in a different language, and you're like, oh, I really like this song, I want to find out what it's about. You find out what it's about, and it just completely ruins it. Even though you could say, oh no, I don't agree with that, you still find it impossible to reinterpret what's going on in the song to actually be something that you agree with. And even if you do manage to, maybe constantly having to think about that every time you listen to the song still ruins it for you. That's a circumstance where you might think, okay, maybe that's why the author should take away the ability for people to understand what they've made, because what if it ruins it for them? So I'm gonna give you another small little analogy. I swear, it's so small, okay? So imagine you're at a restaurant and the food, it smells amazing. You can't wait to eat. It's the best. The waiter brings out your order. You see the order right there. It's like, oh, I can smell it from here. It's the best smelling food I've ever smelled. And immediately he just throws everything in the bin, and someone else comes out and gives you like chicken breasts with nothing, just on their own. You'd expect if this happened in the real world, you'd be like, what the fuck? Where's my food? But in this metaphorical universe, you're okay with it, because it's what literally every single restaurant does. You go to a restaurant, you get a different smell from the kitchen, and then you eat chicken breast with nothing. But the main reason that you're especially okay with it is because what if the food was actually bad? Like, it smelled so good, it smelled amazing, and finding out that it tasted bad after all of that would be such a disappointment. It would ruin your day, and you'd never be able to go back to that restaurant again. Now obviously, again, like I say, people in the real world would never get this far, because if you went to a restaurant that smelled amazing, but then the food was shit, you'd be disappointed, especially if you were really looking forward to it. But then you would just not go back to that restaurant again, and then you would just eat somewhere else, and you'd forget about it. The main reason this is an issue in the world of the metaphor is because you've had that experience the same so many times. You've been to that restaurant like 5-10 times before, and it was a beautifully delicious smelling food, and then you eat chicken breast, right? And you love going and doing that for some reason. For some reason people like doing that in this metaphorical world, even though that's weird. But you love going to this restaurant and smelling the great food, and it's so disappointing to imagine the idea of trying the food and, oh my god, it's shit. I can't ever enjoy this again, because next time I smell that smell, I know it's actually the smell of something that tastes like shit. But much like things in the real world, like with music that you might be disappointed finding out that it was actually bad all along, it is worth being disappointed by that bad restaurant. Even if disappointment from bad restaurants is the most common occurrence, it's absolutely worth it just to be able to enjoy the food from the good restaurants. And so, in other words, it is worth being disappointed by music which sounds good but then ends up being about something that's kind of shit, that you don't agree with, or that makes it too uncomfortable or too whatever for you to enjoy the song anymore. It's absolutely worth it so that you can still have the ability to fully enjoy the songs you do like. And obviously the same goes for any other thing that has a meaning. And actually, just one more small point on top of that. Speaking of that metaphor about restaurants, the reason that metaphor might slightly fall apart is because obviously the immediate reaction you'd have to it is, but I wouldn't go to a restaurant again if they did that. And the reason you wouldn't go to a restaurant again if they did that is because most restaurants don't do that. And so that brings up a good point about Death of the Author, where in actuality, Death of the Author also isn't the majority. Obviously the main reason why it's accepted, whereas the restaurant metaphor thing wouldn't be, is because Death of the Author is seen as a very high art thing to do, where it's not necessarily something you have to do, but it's so common that so many people seem to think that they have to do it to make their art meaningful. But I wanted to say that the reason that so many examples of unanswered mysteries are still enjoyable to so many people is because it's riding off the associations that mysteries already have. The reason existing mysteries excite you is because of the satisfaction you know you'll get when those mysteries are revealed. And so unanswered mysteries are only satisfying because they have those same associations. You see the lead up to an unanswered mystery and it looks the same as the lead up to a real mystery, so it gives you that same feeling of anticipation and excitement. And the only reason that it gives you that same feeling of anticipation and excitement is because real mysteries still exist. So it's essentially leeching off of real mysteries, and it can only really subsist by taking advantage of those associations. So that is another little thing that I wanted to say. But basically, to wrap up pretty much all of this Death of the Author stuff, the conclusions that I want you to take away from this are basically that Death of the Author takes away the ability for people to be disappointed by art, and therefore stops them from being motivated to create their own art. But also, even for people who won't go out of their way to make their own art, it takes away the confidence that they would have in outright disagreeing with whatever the author thinks and saying, you know, I don't think that's correct, I actually prefer my interpretation. Death of the Author makes it difficult to understand what the author actually means, so you never have the confidence to say, I disagree, because you don't know, if you actually do disagree, you don't know what the author's actually saying. And the final point, which is that even in a situation where you wouldn't have the freedom to reinterpret it, because it's so obvious what it means and it's still too uncomfortable for you, it just ruins the whole piece of art. It's still worth that piece of art being ruined for you to be able to fully appreciate and enjoy and possibly disagree with the actual good pieces of art there, or the art out there that you would at least like. Okay, so that was a bunch of shit about Death of the Author. In case I ended up cutting out an explanation for it earlier on, the whole reason I gave that big spiel was actually because I wanted to talk about the other interpretation of Death of the Author and how it's related to the stuff I want to do on the channel going forward. All that being said though, I'm not ready to move on to that just yet. I'll be honest, when I was getting ready to make this video, writing the script about Death of the Author ended up sending me down a long train of thought about a bunch of other stuff. I talked earlier on a bit about how this way of doing things with Death of the Author can actually hurt audiences, but it only really hurts them by taking away their freedom to disagree with something that they otherwise wouldn't really know you were saying anyway. But I ended up thinking about a whole bunch of stuff that actually could genuinely hurt an audience in a substantial way. I don't mean physically, but like shit that could actually manipulate audiences, and it really made me worried to think how little people seem to actually be able to recognize those things if they actually came about. In the end though, when I finished the whole recording, including all of this stuff, it was almost 3 hours long, so I ain't doing all that. But one of the reasons I wanted to talk about all this stuff is because it's been kind of weighing on my mind, and if I don't talk about it now, I feel like I'm going to end up making excuses to talk about some of this stuff in the future when it's not relevant, and it'll just end up putting a bunch of people off, which I don't really want to do. So even though it's not necessarily that relevant now, I still feel like this is the best time to just get it over with and say it, since I want to. And it's not necessarily actually going to be relevant for any game I'm talking about in the future. I mean, maybe, but I don't find it likely. And I don't want to end up making excuses to talk about it. But since I'm not going to spend 3 hours on this, I'm going to skip out a load of stuff like long-winded allegories and explanations and stuff like that. And I'm just going to say what the issue is, why I think it's bad, and maybe how to recognize these issues and deal with them. And I'm going to try and do it quickly. So most of the reason people are actually hiding the meaning of their stories from the audience isn't because they're following Death of the Author as a principle, it's mainly just because doing that is what you're supposed to do in the world of art. So you have a bunch of people creating stuff like stories and music where you really don't have much of an idea of the exact meaning behind them, but they are 100% capable of affecting the way you feel about certain things. Here's the problem. The whole I'm pushing out a story where the whole point is to change the way you feel about something, but I'm not going to let you understand what I'm actually trying to tell you thing is one of the many definitions of something called manipulation. That's not to say that all these pieces of media are actually trying to manipulate you. It's just that if someone wanted to take advantage of the fact that hiding the true meaning of a story is normalized, no one's going to question it because it's normal. And so I'm a bit worried that a lot of people might get stuck in situations where someone's actually creating some movie, story, some book, some song, and perhaps they ended up in a position of power, so they are able to like angel fund something into existence that pushes their belief onto people. I think the best way to deal with that is if you ever see something that feels a bit off and you're a bit worried about what's trying to be pushed onto you, try and understand what you think the message is, and then imagine it being said by some guy on the Joe Rogan podcast, because that way the point rides on its own. It's not true because it was said by a smart character or because it literally happened. It's literally proven by the events of the story. If it's true, it's because you decided it was. You might feel like, yeah, but what do I know? But realistically, it's going to be a choice between you deciding whether it's true or not, or it being definitively true because it was said by an author. And I hopefully don't have to explain that there have been very many shady authors in the past. Now, speaking of proven by the events of the story, one big thing I wanted to talk about is something which I gave a goofy ass name called fictional empiricism. The reason I like to give stuff names like that is because that way you can just say the word. You know, I'm not a huge fan of like fallacies. I ain't gay, but I also think having a word or phrase to actually refer to when you're talking about a certain concept makes it a lot easier, even just to remember. You might know that empirical evidence is something that you observe to be true in front of you rather than being proven true by logic. Now, fictional empiricism isn't just a lie or falsified evidence. Imagine you wanted to manipulate people into believing something you knew isn't true. You might just lie and say that it is, but someone will probably call you out on it. You could falsify evidence, but then someone might find out and then you'd be completely fucked. If only there was a way to lie to people and for them to know it was a lie, but still believe you anyway. Enter fiction. The thing about fiction is that everyone knows it isn't real, and yet they take lessons away from it anyway. that's not a bad thing. Fiction is literally invented so that you can spread lessons without people having to experience whatever led to that lesson themselves. It's just that it can be very easy to take advantage of that. All someone really needs to do is depict something being true in front of an audience, and that audience will be way more likely to believe it than if it was just said by someone in front of them. Especially if you depict some smart character like Sherlock Holmes having that opinion and being literally proven correct. Or if you depict a bunch of stupid or evil characters disagreeing with the opinion and then being proven wrong. Once again, the best way to deal with that is to just imagine whatever opinion you think is being pushed onto you as if it was being said by someone on like a political podcast, taking away the authority they have as an author or director or whatever, and just leaving the opinion. This last point is a bit over-specific, but it's actually something that I've seen myself before, I think, and it's something that I'm genuinely worried is going to start happening more often if people don't recognize it. Basically, this is a specific way that people get an audience to feel negatively towards or even hate a specific demographic that the audience perhaps does not know too much about. They aren't very familiar with. Perhaps there's some kind of alienation between them, like between nations. You don't understand different nations very easily, or between races, or even between demographics that you'd think would be very similar but are actually quite different. So what I'd expect you to see in a situation like this is a story where a number of people in a targeted demographic, that's the demographic that the person writing this wants you to hate, are basically horrible people. And obviously that's what you'd expect from someone trying to get you to hate them. But the main ingredient to make the manipulation work is that you start off with them being pretty much normal, and specifically with them heavily exhibiting one or more innocent stereotypes that are common for that demographic. For an unlikely but easy to understand example, think Irish people going to the pub after work, but they all blow off their wives in a very crass way, like, "Oh, you're gonna come home from the pub, aren't you? Yeah, sure. We're not actually coming. I'm staying out until 2 a.m. Ha ha ha. This is my Irish accent." And then they get very belligerent the more they drink, and then they start doing horrible stuff like groping women and like beating immigrants off on the street. That kind of thing usually works on its own, but the cherry on top is if you depict a member of that demographic who isn't a bad person at all, but crucially doesn't exhibit any of those innocent stereotypes either. So again, in this case, going to the pub after work is an innocent stereotype, but you have jammed it so full of shitty, creepy ways of acting that it's practically impossible to separate them apart unless you are someone that often goes to the pub after work, or, you know, if you're just a normal person who has a brain, I guess. You know, the real examples are a bit more iffy, and I don't really want to give a real example because it might be difficult for you to actually accept. I don't want to be mean, I'm just saying. So obviously the whole point of doing that whole stuff is to not only give the audience a heavy connection between this targeted demographic and those horrible ways of acting, but specifically to make a very strong connection between those innocent stereotypes and the horrible way of acting. Again, they're mashed together so they're difficult to tell apart if you are not used to these kind of ways of acting. The big problem is when an audience sees a story which has a very over-the-top negative depiction of a group of people, they'll tend to come away from it saying, well, obviously not everyone in that group is like that. This manipulation is an attempt to take control of that instinct. So when people leave like the movie theater or wherever after like seeing a movie like this, those audience members will say to themselves, well, not all of them are going to be like that. But the problem is, as I've said maybe like 3 times by now, that collection of innocent stereotypes is a part of that. They don't all act like that. They aren't all going to the pub after work. So when one of these audience members finds out that most people in that demographic actually do act like that, they think, oh my god, it was all true, because they've lost the ability to separate those innocent stereotypes from the horrible actions, especially if those innocent stereotypes are something that the audience demographic don't usually do themselves or can't understand very well, or is something that the targeted demographic finds difficult to talk about. In fact, sometimes it gets so bad that the stereotypes exhibited by the audience demographic are seen as completely innocent, while the exact same stereotype for the targeted demographic is given an evil or like simple-minded false motivation. Like I said, the reason I'm giving this example is because I've seen something similar before, and I'm genuinely worried that people who see it in front of them, even if they're in the targeted demographic, won't be able to recognize it unless it's explained to them beforehand. So honestly, even if only one person actually even pays attention to this, I'll see it as something worthwhile saying. So anyway, that's that. I'm finally ready to get back to the stuff related to the channel. So as a recap, Death of the Author is about how audiences should hold their own interpretation of a story as more valuable than the intention of the author. And one of the ways that many writers or authors or creators in general decide to follow this principle is by keeping their intentions hidden from the audience. And again, my conclusions were that taking away the option of understanding the author's intention not only takes agency away from the audience, but most importantly gets them stuck in a kind of limbo where they forever want to find out what the author really meant and are never able to reach that stage of understanding the meaning where they feel comfortable choosing their own interpretation. In fact, actually, it kind of comes across like a lot of authors don't want to give up the authority that they have while the audience still doesn't understand the whole of their story, which would be taken away from them if their audience felt more comfortable going with their own conclusions instead. So, maybe that's the case. Anyway, the main reason I wanted to go over all of that was because of something I mentioned earlier in the video. I plan to eventually start giving my thoughts on the games that I'm playing in a semi-video essay-esque format, although I don't imagine I'm ever actually going to be as good as the other people who make video essays. But when I'm doing that, I wouldn't be surprised if some of the things I have to say actually directly disagree with the intentions of the game's story. The big problem is that I'm kind of worried how people will take it, because it might give people the feeling that I'm piggybacking off the effort that was put into making the game, and that I don't deserve the same platform as the creators, or that my opinions are simplistic or plebeian, simply because I'm a person talking and giving my opinion directly rather than embedding it into a story. And that's part of the reason I went on such a big tangent about the whole not being able to deal with it explanation of why so many people like Death of the Author in media, as well as how people can end up feeling like they're kind of basic for thinking they know better than the guy on the silver screen. Because even if I say something extremely agreeable and relevant and just so smart, the simple fact that I'm a person talking to you would put me on the level of an audience member, which, without understanding the good side of Death of the Author, would basically mean that my opinion could never hold a candle to that of an author or artist or director or even a lowly game developer, just because those people are hidden away behind layers of dialogue and art and gameplay. This isn't to say that art is just a meaningless veneer or is inherently manipulative. It's just that the opinions of an audience member are as valid as the artist. And even though I'm now also going to be up on kind of a pedestal just for being the guy posting the video, I'm still acting as an audience member to their messages. And I hope that I'll be able to say what I think is important without feeling like I'm going to be looked down on for it. And hopefully, you can too. Did that make sense? Okay, congratulations, you made it. You're actually at the end of the video now. Almost, because there's still just a bit more that I wanted to talk about. This isn't really related as much to the channel as the other stuff, even the stuff in the middle that was barely related at all. But there's some stuff I wanted to talk about just before I finish. So when I was editing an earlier version of the video, I was going around picking out songs from the Rain World OST. I don't know if you've seen my other videos, but I think pretty much every single one of them has something from the Rain World OST in it, even if it's just like the ambience at the end of the video. So I was going to do that again because it's a staple. But I caught myself feeling nostalgic. It just made me immediately feel like I wish I could go back to when I was making videos in uni and this is what I was doing. And then I sort of said, I shouldn't feel that way. I shouldn't feel all nostalgic. I should, think of ways to feel good about the future. But I kind of realized something. So a while ago, I played this game called Fractal Block World, it's this game where you're basically going around in this 3D space made of blocks, like Minecraft blocks, like Minecraft. But the gimmick of it is you can shrink and you can grow. And when you shrink, you start off like the size of one block, but when you shrink, that one block becomes like 16 by 16 by 16 smaller blocks. And sometimes you shrink next to a block and it becomes like a whole other structure, like it becomes like a room that you can go into. So the reason I'm talking about this game is because there was something I did in the game which actually did a fairly good job of explaining the way I felt. So the explanation I'm going to give you isn't exactly the same as how the game is, but it sort of encompasses the general point of it. So basically, imagine you're playing this game and you come up to like a floating island, right? And on that island is a couple things, like a flower and like a pyramid or something. And one of the things in there is like a town. And the town is where you need to go to progress in the game. But before going in the town, you notice there's like a cave in the island. You're like, oh, I want to go into this little cave in the surface of the island. I'll go down here and I'll shrink down and I'll explore inside the island. Just as a short little side thing before I go on with the main quest or whatever. So I'm using a diagram to help explain this, right? So basically, you imagine I've gone into this cave, right? And I'm exploring the cave and I'm like, oh, look, here, there are 2 blocks. One of them is a red block and one of them is a blue block. Isn't that interesting? I'm going to shrink down and go inside the red block. So I do that, and what do I find? Oh, there's a yellow block, an orange block, and a purple block. Isn't that interesting? Okay, so I go inside the yellow block and I'm like, oh, okay, this is like a loot room. I get a bunch of loot and I pick up the loot. That's fine. That's the end of that. Okay, let's check out the orange room. And inside the orange room is 2 more blocks. And inside one of those blocks is another 3 blocks. And then inside one of those blocks is another 2 blocks. And it goes on and on and on until I've explored all the dead end blocks in the orange block. I come out, I'm like, okay, oh, right, yeah. I've still got to do the purple block now. So I go into the purple block and guess what? It happens again. There's like a billion different blocks to go inside and explore and see what's inside of them. So finally I come out of the purple block. I'm like, okay, I've explored everything. Oh, I've explored everything here as well. I come out of the red block. And I'm like, oh wait, what's in the blue block? Guess what? Hell! It's hell! Just a million blocks. And so, you imagine I've gone through all this shit. And I've gone down, blocks and blocks and blocks. And I've come out of, finally I've explored all of the blue block as well. And I'm sort of getting into it. I'm exploring a block. I'm like, okay, what's inside that? That's what's inside that. That's cool. I come out. I'm like, okay, I've explored all the blocks here. I come back out again. I've explored all the blocks here. I come back out again. I've explored all the blocks here. I come back out again. I'm like, what's this? Where am I now? Oh, I'm at the island that I started off on, where I forgot that the entire reason I was here wasn't to explore some dumbass cave with a million blocks. It was to go to this town, and literally all of that for ages was just a tangent that I was just wasting some time on. So the reason that I'm giving you this explanation is because that's the way I felt when I suddenly got that feeling of nostalgia. It felt suddenly like the last actually genuinely 4 years since I left uni was just like a side tangent of doing other shit that I had to do, right? I had to get a job, I had to get a new place to live, etc, etc. So I had to do all that stuff, but it all felt like a tangent, the stuff I didn't really actually find any meaning in doing. And now that I was back to making videos and I was doing something that reminded me a lot of those videos that I made, I suddenly realized this is the shit that actually made me feel like I was doing something. Everything else was, oh, you know, I have to get a job, I had to get a place to live, you know, I have to vacuum my room, I have to make food, I have to, you know, clean the windows, right? But those are all stuff that I want to get done, but I'm doing it because I have to do it. And I realized it had literally been like 4 years since I'd done something that I actually wanted to do that was actually meaningful. You know, I mean, I still sit around and I watch YouTube videos and play games, but like, all of that was like, you know, time wasting stuff. This was the first time I actually felt like I was doing something in like 4 actual years that didn't feel like just a necessity or a chore. And that's what's so good about it, because even coming back to it, you know, even back then, the reason it felt meaningful and satisfying to do was because, oh, you know, it's like I'm actually, you know, being one of these epic Let's Players that I used to watch when I was growing up. You know, I'm actually doing a good job at making this channel. But now, what feels meaningful about it is the idea of being able to talk about the games that I'm playing and actually talk about things that I've not heard other people talk about that I think could be talked about. Wouldn't that be interesting? And so that's nice, that's epic, and I'm glad that I'm feeling like I get to come back and do the shit that I actually find meaningful. But yeah, that's all I wanted to say. All I wanted to say in the whole video has now been said, so we're done. We're at the ending. To finish off, like I said earlier, probably the next video I'll do is a Beware video, just because I've been so long since I've actually done any of those, and I'm so far behind. I think I already explained how far behind I am. There's like a bunch of new versions. But yeah, I gotta catch up, because I want to play all those subversions. Subversion, what does that mean? I distracted myself. Yeah, I want to play all those versions, and I want to get done with it. And who knows what else I'll do? Who knows what other things I'll get up to? But with all of that said, for now, the video has come to an end. So, if you liked the video, you can give it a like. If you want to see more videos, you can subscribe. And other than that, I suppose I'll see you in the next video that I see you in. See ya.